So Donald Trump is continuing to make more and more mistakes as his administration gets underway. Here we got Chicago braces for potential National Guard deployment as Trump points to violent weekend. See, so Chicago, just like all the other large, big liberal cesspool cities, is being overrun with violence, and it has been for years. This isn't anything new. I mean, Kanye West talked about it. Last year Chicago had over 600 caskets. You know what I mean? That goes back over 2 decades ago when he was talking about that. So I mean, violent crime in Chicago is nothing new. But now President Donald Trump is pointing to more than 50 people shot in Chicago over the Labor Day weekend as a reason for deploying the National Guard to the city. So here's the thing. Trump's decision to, initiate National Guard troops and take federal action in D.C. is completely different from anything going on in the states and cities. See, D.C. is the only area that the federal government has the right to kind of, police. That's DC is not within any of the 50 states in the United States. It's a standalone entity, and like that's what a lot of people don't understand. It's wasn't supposed to be within a state because the designers of our government understood that they didn't want any state to have basically favoritism over any other state. So they established the District of Columbia to be the home of the federal government. It was, completely separate from everywhere else. So there Trump is right. He has the authority to do that. But when it comes to, federal troops inside a, state or city, that's on those governments and those citizens to request them there. That's why they had the Posse Comitatus Act. It was, to give the authority to the citizens of that area to not use federalized troops. You know what I mean? Like this is how we move closer to martial law. This is how we move closer to checkpoints and looking more like a third world country. Democrat leaders are doubling down with Governor J.B. Pritzker and Mayor Brandon Johnson set to speak out Tuesday afternoon about the potential federal deployment. And here, just like always, you got these trash Democratic leaders of these cities that, they're soft on crime. You got, and not just the mayor and the governors. You got these terrible judges that let these violent criminals out with soft sentences or no sentence at all, and they're just terrorizing the citizens of Chicago and terrorizing the citizens of Illinois or whatever city or state we happen to be talking about. And until the people actually start to engage and hold these representatives accountable and ask them to protect them and to allow the police to do their job, you're going to have people on the right that are trying to justify Donald Trump doing this. And this is where the people on the right need to recognize that Donald Trump is wrong on this. There's lots of stuff that Donald Trump's doing wrong. The tariffs. The only branch of our government that has the authority to tax and impose tariffs is Congress, not Donald Trump, not the executive branch. The Republicans need to stop justifying all of the unconstitutional things that Donald Trump wants to do because they're caught up on their team. Biden was horrible. Kamala Harris is horrible. But that doesn't mean that Donald Trump is doing anything right. Donald Trump ran on not getting us involved in wars. Donald Trump has been back in Ukraine. We're moving further and further closer to more conflict with Russia. We dropped bombs on Iran. Back in Israel, when everything's showing so far that everything Israel's doing in Gaza are potentially international war crimes. And, we got the tariffs. We got deploying the National Guard potentially to cities and states that aren't requesting their assistance. You can look at a lot of the stuff that Donald Trump says, regarding the woke politics, and you can say, okay, well, he's right about that. But that doesn't give him the authority to do a whole lot about it. Donald Trump's basically shaking down these countries, trying to put was either Nvidia or Intel, one of these companies. He was trying to impose basically export taxes. That's not even something Congress has the authority to do. You know, the Republicans have the House, the Senate, the executive branch, and you still saw an increase in the size of the budget. You know, the big beautiful bill, or the big bunch of bullshit, whatever you want to look at it as. You know, Republicans had the chance to come in and do something about it. Instead, they increase the spending. They're increasing the debt. They're doing all of the things, you know, basically against what Donald Trump was voted in for. Now, I was an independent. I was a libertarian. I voted in favor of Donald Trump. Unfortunately, I was wrong. You know, I was trying to be optimistic. You know, the choices were Trump or Harris. You know, we knew what we were going to get with Harris because it was the same thing that we had under Biden. You know, and you listen to Donald Trump, and he tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. His first administration was terrible, you know, regardless of what anybody thinks. His debt, he was increasing the deficit. He was doing all sorts of terrible things. None of the structural problems of our economy were fixed under Trump's first administration. All he did was go on the news and tell you the economy was great, and nothing really changed. It was just basically people's perception that everything was better. And then everybody just thinks that the only reason the economy was blowing up was because of the COVID years. And that's just not accurate. You know, we were starting to see problems in the economy even before COVID hit. So, you know, we just got to, people need to hold Trump accountable, because when you don't, it diminishes your credibility. Because now, in a few years, when Donald Trump is voted out and they put in some radical socialist Democrat that wants to expand the executive authority and do all sorts of unconstitutional things, we won't have any justification to argue against it, because you supported so much unconstitutional action under the Donald Trump administration.